Hi everyone, welcome to the launch of the Global Manifesto for Fair Platform Work. In anticipation of the ILO's meeting of experts on decent work in the platform economy, today we are presenting and discussing a manifesto for fairer platform work to protect and ensure the rights of platform workers across the world. The document was developed by leading researchers from different countries and institutions involved in analyzing the platform economy and its consequence on workers. This manifesto argues that fair conditions for platform workers should be in place to address the lack of rights and protections. It advocates for urgent international guidelines and outlines the challenges posed by the new labor relations in crucial aspects such as misclassification, low pay, health, safety risk, discrimination, non-transparent algorithmic management, and more. We request that everyone's opinion and perspective are respected in this space. This event is being recorded. The recording will be available after the event. Your questions will be answered at the end of the session. Please use the Zoom Q&A to send your questions, and the questions can be upvoted, open, or commented upon. I am Oscar Maldonado from Fair Work Colombia at Universidad del Rosario, and today I will be the chair of this panel. We have today as speakers a group of international experts on platform work. We have Dr. Alessio Bertolini from Fair Work at Oxford Internet Institute, who will present the manifesto. And then we will have in our discussion panel, Professor Sandra Fredman from University of Oxford, Mrs. Anita Gurumurthy, Executive Director of IT for Change, and Professor Vina Duval from UC Hastings College of the Law. At the end, as I said before, we would like to open the discussion to the questions of the audience. So let's start with the presentation of the manifesto by Alessio. So, Alessio.
Thanks a lot, Oscar. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully it will work. Can you see my presentation?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, yeah, I'm here to present this Global Manifesto for Fairer Platform Work. The manifesto is really the outcome of really a collective work, not just of the past few days, but also of the past few years of several researchers working for Fair Work, but also in a sense indirectly really the work of a lot of researchers working on platform work around the world. So the initial proposal upon which this manifesto is based is a paper written by Sandra Fredman, which is with us today, but also by Darcy Dubois, Mark Graham, Aradhana Cherupara, Badekatil, Gautam Bhatia, and Alessio Bertolini, which is myself. There was a paper published as an international regulation of platform labor, a proposal for action, which was published last year in the Weizenbaum Journal of the Digital Society. And what's the idea behind this manifesto? Well, as many of you know, there have been like hundreds of researchers, of independent researchers around the world, working in universities, academies, research centers, think tanks, and other institutions who have highlighted the many issues that platform workers face in their daily life on a daily basis. And what we believe is actually that their research, their findings, and their recommendations play an important role in interrogating platform claims about their working model, and especially platform-funded research and lobbying activities. We also believe that our findings and suggestions should really inform policymaking, both at the local, at the national, but also in this case, especially at the international level. And what is the purpose of this global manifesto? As Oscar was saying earlier, the International Labour Organization is hosting a meeting of experts on decent work in the platform economy next week from the 10th to the 14th of October in Geneva. And this will be the occasion for many of these experts to discuss the necessity for more and better.
Sorry, Alessio, can you get a bit closer to the microphone? The
Yes.
sound is not working very well. Sorry.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, much better.
Yeah. So it will be an occasion for these experts to discuss the necessity for more and better regulations at the global level. And what we believe is that the voice of all these researchers and work of all these researchers across the world should be heard. So what does the manifesto ask for? So the signatories of the manifesto appeal to the International Labour Organization to carefully consider the problems that different platform workers are facing and to implement relevant policy recommendations. And the signatories also urge the International Labour Organization to adopt a convention of platform work to cater for the specific needs and specific and urgent needs of platform works globally. So why do we need an ILO convention on platform work? Well, first of all, because we believe the flexibility and autonomy that characterize platform work do not have to come with precarity and insecurity. There are millions of workers around the world who rely on platform work for their income, for their livelihood. According to estimates from 2019, about 1 of 10 workers, for example, in the UK work in the gig economy, and the percentage in the US is 8%. A more recent survey in Africa showed that 1.3% of adults earn money on platforms. And the numbers are likely to grow in the aftermath of the pandemic, but also with technological change and with increased digitalization and platformization of many jobs. And although many of these workers appreciate the flexibility, the autonomy, and the limited barriers to entry that platform work offers, they often struggle with poor working conditions, with limited rights and protections, and with precarity and insecurity. So what are the problems specifically that these workers face? Well, many of these workers are often classified by platforms as self-employed or independent contractor. So platforms don't have any obligation to pay work minimum wage because they don't fall within the scope of minimum wage legislation. And although these workers are considered self-employed, they have limited power to negotiate rates. You can imagine that an Uber driver or a delivery rider cannot impose how much they want to be paid or how much they want to impose as a fare. But also, workers spend a large amount of time in unpaid work, searching and waiting for work. So although they might be logged into the app and might be driving or riding around the city, they are not paid whilst they're waiting for a job. And also many of these workers, particularly in the cloud work, but not only confined to cloud work, are also at risk of seeing their pay being withheld because a client might not be satisfied with the work they get done, and they have limited power to counteract client's claim because platform power dynamics tends to favor the client's opinion and the client's comment. But also, and again, because these workers are classified as self-employed in the vast majority of cases, they also have to pay the cost out of pocket for many work-related items, including fuels, equipment, insurance, rental of vehicles, and so on and so forth. And the platform doesn't reimburse them for these costs. Workers are also subjected to, in many cases, unsafe working conditions. They face forms of physical and mental harm that, of course, have been amplified during the pandemic, as these workers were performing, in many cases, essential services with very little. A work survey, for example, showed that 50% of workers, cloud workers in Africa and Asia, lost sleep as a result of the work they do. The problem is not just confined with pay and working. Many of these workers sign contracts without being able to read or understand them properly. In many cases, they are written in a language they're not familiar with. But also, many of the terms and conditions and contract might not be always accessible and easily accessible to them through the app or the website of the platform. And in many cases, the contract applicable law might be that of the country where the platform's headquarters are located rather than the one where the worker works. And of course, this makes it very difficult for workers to counteract and raise legal grievances. But also workers are classified as self-employed, but in many cases, as many court cases and court decisions around the world have demonstrated that they are misclassified as such, and they have very little power to challenge international platforms. And even those countries that do not misclassify workers often complain clauses which limit the platform's obligation towards workers and limited the possibility for workers to seek legal redress. But also, a lot of research has shown that women and ethnic minorities face particular risk of bad ratings and being excluded for opportunities that might be subjected to biased algorithms and non-neutral AI tools. And there is often no recourse to due process when discrimination happens, but also more generally, in any case where a platform takes a decision, a disciplinary decision towards the worker. And finally, but not least important, conditions in the gig economy, because there's generally not a fixed workplace, because workers might not know who their co-workers or their colleagues are. They are in a structurally weak bargaining position. And it's very difficult, or in some cases even impossible, for workers to have a collective voice and to coordinate collective action. So what does the Global Manifesto demand? So here is just a summary of the main points that we raise in the manifesto, but you can read them more precisely in more detail in our manifesto page. So first of all, we ask the extension of minimum wage legislation to all platform workers, including those paid on a piece rate. And because of the problem with unpaid work that I raised earlier, also we believe that the definition of working time used to calculate minimum wages should include both direct and indirect costs. And workers, again, irrespective of their employment classifications, should earn at least the local minimum wage or the wage set by collective agreement, whichever is higher, after work-related costs are taken into account. And workers, irrespective again of their employment classifications, should earn at least the living wage after work-related costs in the case that the minimum wage set at the national level is too low to have a decent or a basic but decent standard of living. And finally, workers should be paid on time with no delays and for all the works they have completed, because this is work they have done. When it comes to fair conditions, again, we want health and safety legislation should be extended to all platform workers, regardless of their employment status. Also, platforms should have policies in place to protect workers from risk arising from their work, and should also take proactive measures to protect workers' health and safety. As well, the platform should be made responsible for paying social security and contribution, which is not the case for the vast majority of platforms that use self-employed workers. And where the state benefits are not available for whatever reason, they should be encouraged to provide benefits on a private basis. Platforms should also implement measures to mitigate and reduce the risk of unpaid work and overwork. And finally, but not least important, because the platforms often accumulate a lot of data and they use them for commercial purposes, we also believe that platforms should take adequate measures to protect workers' personal data. When it comes to fair contract, the contract or the terms and conditions must be available in at least the country's main languages, not just the English, for example, or the main language of where the platforms is located. Also, given that many workers around the world come from a migrant background, the contracts and the terms and conditions should be in the languages that the main migrant workers group speak. Contracts and conditions should also be accessible to workers all the time, and the applicable law should not be that where the platform headquarters is, but rather where the ones of the country where the worker works. The regulation should also prohibit clauses which unreasonably accept the platform from any liability that should arise from the working relationship, and should also notify workers of any proposed changes in a reasonable time frame. So workers shouldn't just log into the platform, see that the platform has implemented a change, and in order to start working, they have to agree to these new changes. When it comes to fair management, all workers, again, regardless of their employment status, should be provided with due process in relation to any disciplinary decision or even more for any decision of termination of the working relationship, and should be able to appeal those decisions. And given that a lot of the communication between platforms workers is often automated, and workers find it difficult to communicate with a human representative, platforms should provide a channel for workers to communicate with a human representative and should be able to respond within a reasonable time frame. And given the many discrimination to which platform workers are subjected, again, regardless of the employment status, they should be afforded effective protection against any form of discrimination for any vulnerable category. And platforms should also promote equality of opportunity for all workers, and especially for those from disadvantaged. Finally, but again, not least important, when it comes to fair representation, platforms should allow and set up mechanisms for the expression of collective worker voice, and should allow platform workers to collectively organize and bargain. And legislation should be revised on purpose to facilitate this. And given that many labor rights are still rooted in more traditional forms of work from the kind of industrial era, we also believe that existing collective labor rights should be adequately aligned to the condition of platform work, to take into account of the particular conditions in which platform workers work and organize. So this is just a summary of some data from Fair Work. So we have rated over 282 platforms in the past 3 years in over, I think, 25 countries. And as you can see, less than half of the platforms meet some of the basic criteria for decent standards of work. And when it comes, for example, to collective bargaining and representation, about 4.2% of platforms meet these thresholds. So this could definitely show that there's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of regulations to be improved and implemented to guarantee basic fair standards of work in the platform economy around the world. So in conclusion, as I said, platform work provides a livelihood for millions of workers around the world, and in the next few years, these numbers are likely to increase quite substantially, and it has definitely the potential to offer autonomy for many workers. However, as research around the world has highlighted, it is also a type of work which is associated with low pay, precarity, insecurity, and lack of rights. So we really urge the ILO to take a step towards fairer platform work. So if you haven't signed the manifesto yet, the manifesto has been signed so far about half an hour ago. At least the last estimate was of 188 researchers from about 40 countries in the world who signed the manifesto. So if you haven't signed yet and you're interested in doing so, please sign it now at fair.work/manifesto. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessio, for this presentation. And so I think we can have a round of impressions on the manifesto. So first of all, we would like to listen to Sandra's impressions.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm so glad to be here as part of this platform to be launching this manifesto, which is of enormous importance, not only for platform workers, but for all workers. Because if we don't have fair and decent work for platform workers, then we undercut terms and conditions for all workers, knowing as we do how contracting out and privatization is working to undermine how easy it is for employers to move from formal employment into precarious and informal employment and undermine everybody's terms and conditions. So I think this is a really important initiative, and I'm very glad to have been part of the Fair Work project from its very early days. And I think what I should stress is that this manifesto is not just based on what we would love to see, but it's very closely based on both the evidence that's been gathered by the Fair Work project on the ground, working with platform workers and platforms, and on existing ILO standards. So the aim of the manifesto is to take ILO standards, which have already been agreed, and to show how they need to be adapted for the specific needs of platform workers, so that these are already standards which have achieved a wide degree of consensus. But what they haven't had is the empirical base to show where platform workers are slipping through the net and then undermining, obviously, decent work for platform workers, which is itself an important aspiration, and also the risk of contagion of other workers through a race to the bottom. So these 5 principles that you can see: fair pay, fair conditions, fair contracts, fair management, and fair representation, these were generated early on in the project through wide consultation with many, many different stakeholders, and a wide consensus as to what are the key issues that should be addressed in ensuring decent work for platform workers. As a crucial and important threshold point, this manifesto isn't dependent on what kind of classification, employment classification workers have. So we know, and Alessio has already stressed, that platform workers are almost always, although not always, but almost always classified as independent contractors, which allows platforms to escape both the title of employer and any kind of regulation, or most kinds of regulation of workers, which are already there in domestic labor law systems. And what one of the crucial points that we make in this manifesto is that these are terms and conditions which should apply regardless of the way in which the platforms classify their workers, which could be as independent contractors, and we acknowledge that some workers want to be independent contractors, but that shouldn't be at the expense of their decent terms and conditions of work. So although there have been really important and continuing important campaigns through litigation and through policy change to reclassify platform workers as under a contract of employment, we know that platforms continually reconfigure that relationship to escape this legal classification. So what we really need is to be sure that terms and conditions apply across the board, regardless of this classification. So that's the background and important point. Just to say a few brief things about these 5 conditions and to show how we've taken existing ILO standards and matched them against the experience of platform workers, and then proposed how they should be adapted for platform work. So, for example, fair pay. Now, as a start, minimum wage legislation is often confined to workers under a contract of employment, although not always. So our first proposal is that all workers should be covered by minimum wage legislation. But as soon as you do that, you realize that platform workers are actually in a different position, to the extent, firstly, that they almost always have to absorb their own expenses. And if that comes out of that minimum wage, actually it pushes the minimum wage the net minimum wage well below. So that it only really works for platform workers if we make sure that the level of minimum pay includes or is after the deduction of expenses. So that's why we say that this definition should be after work-related costs, such as fuel. If we think of Uber drivers, they have to pay for their own fuel, they have to pay for their own insurance, they have to have the maintenance of their own vehicles, they have to either buy or hire their own vehicles, and all of those, and the same for delivery workers and so on. And all of that is a great burden on their pay packet. So that's why we say it should be after work related costs. And we also acknowledge, as Alessio stressed from the empirical evidence, that a lot of the time spent is waiting or looking for work. The UK Court of Appeal actually recognized for Uber drivers that waiting time should be seen as part of their contractual hours, but that should go across the board. So when you look at how much is earned per hour, it should include those hours. And it's true for domestic workers as well, who have to go between between employers. As far as fair conditions go, again, there's a wide consensus that there should be health and safety at work, and the ILO has many conventions on health and safety at work. But of course, it's dependent on a paradigm of a workplace. And if we don't have a workplace, then how do the ILO conventions apply? So what we're proposing is a much wider definition of workplace, so-called place, to include platform workers. We can see the ILO convention, the recent one on violence at work, has also got a very wide definition, but this should go even further. And we should also take into account where workers work in other people's premises, such as the domestic workers that we cover on the Fair Work Project. And in that case, both the third party or the final user of the service and the platform should be liable. And we also suggest social security contributions, which are crucial for workers on precarious work. As far as fair contracts are concerned, Alessio has already set out the main aspects of our proposals, which are again based on existing and consensual ILO standards. The one thing which I should add to that is that even if it's a contract, an independent contractor, there is still a contract, and that needs to be taken into account. And actually, we've made a kind of comparison with consumer contracts as well, where the manufacturer is still liable for the quality and the safety of the product, even if they have very wide exemption clauses. So that's why we say regulation should prohibit clauses which unreasonably exempt the platform from liability for working conditions, negligence, or the like, and should make sure that there is a prohibition on clauses preventing workers from effectively seeking redress. And there have been cases where Uber, say in South Africa, said there's a dispute with a worker and you should go and pursue your grievance in the Netherlands, or in Canada, the Canadian, there's a Canadian case where it said you should go and pursue your grievance in the Netherlands, which for a poorly paid worker is really useless. Fair management, again, I think we've stressed that it's about workers having transparency, channels for communication, but also, and I would also stress, the equality of opportunity of workers. We know, as Alessio has shown, that women and other minorities, women and minorities and people with intersectional identities, actually the inequalities in the formal workforce are replicated and enhanced in this workforce. And therefore, where there are such clear differences in pay, in representation, platforms should take steps to find out why and to remedy it. And possibly the most important is that workers need to be able to band together and get their voice heard. So, and again, the fair representation is right at the center of ILO, of the ILO mission, and again, needs to be adapted for this very challenging situation where workers are dispersed, domestic workers, workers who drive their own vehicles, delivery workers. It could be, it's not always, but it could be very difficult to find collective spaces and ways of expressing their collective organization. So that's just a very brief run through of telling you why we put together this manifesto in the way in which we have, and urging you to put your weight behind it so that we can steer the ILO towards underwriting fair working conditions for platform workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for such insightful comments. So I would like to give the voice to Anita for your impressions. So Anita, please.
Thanks so much. Am I audible? Would it be possible to put up my slides, if that's okay? Thank you so much. Yeah, right. What I'd like to do is to use this extremely comprehensive and a product that has been constructed with so much care, so much participation and reflection, just to peg a few thoughts coming from the Global South and our research as well as experience of working with trade unions, conducting educational activities, pedagogic kind of activities, and bring some reflections to the 4 or 5 different aspects of the manifesto. So I'd like to request for the first slide, the next one. Yes. So this is a focus on fair pay, and the manifesto talks about how workers, irrespective of their employment classification, should earn at least a living wage after work-related costs. There is, I think, an important insight here with respect to our imagination of who these workers are. And as Sandra rightly pointed out, I think it's important to remember that domestic workers are not the same as Uber drivers, are not the same as masseurs who work on urban company, etc. Nor is the home-based worker who works on Amazon Mechanical Turk in one of these AI-based value chains. Her experience is not going to be similar to the Uber driver. So at some level, I think the relationship between minimum remuneration standards for self-employed and the wages systems for employees has to be understood as a very complex interplay. And there are 2 approaches: countries where there is a universal minimum wage that becomes a relevant reference point for negotiations among relevant stakeholders. And in certain other countries with industry level minimum pay classifications, for instance, for transport workers, or through collective agreements and awards that trade unions have managed, levels for workers may actually be pegged to what's called, a classification of skills. So in a particular industry, in India, this is pretty prevalent. You actually see unskilled workers, skilled workers. I mean, however problematic they may be, it's extremely important that universal minimum wage, skill-based minimum wage rate systems have to be evolved. And we do not look at this as a kind of homogenized workforce. And that's something I would come to in a couple of next slides. And there is a need, I think, for platform liability to ensure minimum wage. And this becomes extremely important in cross-border contexts, because the context of AMT, Amazon Mechanical Turk. So the Turkers often work in countries which pretty much, like Sandra said, is a race to the bottom context. And many of them, for instance, our research in Tamil Nadu in India shows that these are women from very small towns, and they may really not have any bargaining power at all. And the platform is simply an intermediary with clients who originate in the United States often. And their work day is usually, in terms of the time zone, the nighttime for them. And after finishing a day's work, basically household and domestic work, they actually sit at the computer, and yes, they just keep waiting throughout the night for a task to pop up. And this kind of work condition requires a certain enforcement, not only of pay, but of course, of fair conditions that require us to understand global hierarchies in labor chains. And the WISO report also had flagged an important objection to the development of standards pertaining to self-employed workers in certain contexts, that there may be multiple parties involved in determining rates of pay, and this may render the application of remuneration regulations very, very difficult. And so one of the solutions that's been offered here by researchers, scholars, is that the platform could be responsible for setting up its systems in such a way and algorithmically tweak it in such a way that there is a certain positive kind of enforcement and discrimination, and that no value below the relevant proportion of an hourly minimum wage can be entered by the customer. So you actually then prevent any wage or pricing related information from appearing that is below that threshold. The next one, please. I'd like to talk a little bit about fair conditions and platforms as the manifesto points quite pertinently should have policies to protect workers from risk arising from their work and take proactive measures. But I think the imagination of what safety is, what well-being is a broader idea. And I think at the bottom of it is a huge context of economic risks, where we do need to see work and work arrangements as part of labor market conditions that arise in a certain platform or platformizing economy. And there are two voices from our study in a different context that I have plugged there, which is soon after the pandemic, we interviewed women who worked on urban company providing services for wellness, and others who female taxi drivers. And they talk about the commission, and they take 26% commission. The Uber rate is a standard, and even if the diesel rate goes up, there's no thought from Uber that drivers should be compensated accordingly. If it is a leased car, which means Uber has actually given on loan the car to the driver, they take even 3/4. It can never work out if you're driving a leased car. Similarly, this entire idea of claiming that the market conditions really are not, profitable, and therefore commissions have to be increased, but the price is fixed for each customers, and that pricing is opaque to the worker. And this, as the workers talk about, just stays in the app, which basically means that there's no transparency. So I think plugging economic risks in respect of non-transparency of pricing mechanisms, right destination. In fact, the French law, for instance, allows you to perceive or allows the driver to make a choice based on knowing that the destination is XYZ. So that's important. And although it may not be part of the ILO resolution or the manifesto's recommendation to the ILO resolution, I think labor regulation is just part of the solution. I think platform economy solutions regulations are very, very important in terms of pricing, oligopolies, abuse of market power, monopolies, and of course, penalties for flouting rules and arbitrariness, which could indeed be integrated into labor conditions. The next one. There's a curious point with respect to contracts, and I also saw that there was one of those questions which asks, and this comes up in many discussions, do workers and platforms really care about employment status? And I think I'd urge everybody to read this beautiful interview by James Ferrer, after the Uber case. And this is in Dissent. The magazine is called Dissent. And he talks about how misclassification and contracts today, they are simply not correlated at all. And he says, what's next is the issue of data and algorithmic control, which is part of the misclassification game. And quite evocatively, he says, and I quote, with misclassification, we are like a dysfunctional couple that can't talk about the relationship we are in. We've got to call a job economic opportunity. We've got to call recruitment onboarding. We have to use all these words to misdescribe essentially what scholars would say, misrecognize what's really happening. What's even more effective is if we use algorithmic control rather than words at all. So I quite like this representation because I think regulation should not privilege classification of employment relationship as the determining factor for employment relationship. And here I think it's worthwhile taking note of the proposed directive of the European Parliament to improve working conditions on platform work. And I quote from the directive, "The determination of an employment relationship shall be guided primarily by the facts relating to the actual performance of work, taking into account the use of algorithms in the organizing of platform work, irrespective of how the relationship is classified in any contractual arrangement that may have been agreed by the parties involved." And I think this is profoundly important because we're not talking about erasing power, but bringing back power into the platform economy equations. And it's extremely vital that we recognize that these are not relationships where the worker actually is able to give consent in a context. And often for AMT workers, it's just a license that pops up and you're actually saying yes, yes, yes. And it's indeed impossible, here to say, well, I accept. And when the question is of structural injustice, you can't really be individualizing these contracts. And therefore, I think the misclassification debates show us how contracts become somewhat of a red herring when you really look at the way in which you have to pin down the employment relationship. What's very interesting about the directive, and that is not on the slide, is this wonderful observation that in the event there is a contest, in the courts, the burden of proof is not on the worker. The burden of proof is on the platform. And that, I think, is extremely important because that particular clause in the directive recognizes that I will claim that I was exploited, and it's your job to show that you didn't exploit me. And that's, I think, extremely important. The next one is on fair management. So I'd like to quote a little bit from this document that IT for Change came out with, which is something that's the new frontier for the labor agenda that even James Ferrer and Aslam, both of them identify, which is workers' data rights in the platformized workplace. And this bundle of rights is something that we see as very important. And we've been working with different labor unions in the context of our work in India, primarily to elucidate, help them articulate what are the conditions of exploitation because of algorithms, but also to look at alternative imaginaries of algorithmic relationships, because we cannot wish away the platform economy, and we also need to make good the opportunities that it may offer for remote work. So here I think algorithmic control must be recognized as synonymous with even managerial control. I think that's quite important. And there is, I think, something we'd like to add to the mix, which is in the nature of a problematization, which I think will be useful to debate. When we actually look at pervasive platformization of value chains, let's take the case of EdTech, right? And in India, there is this very big company called Byju's, which is literally the Amazon in the education industry. In EdTech, there are women who are teachers who wait the whole day for Byju's to give them a slot to tutor a student. And obviously, the person's mobility, the person's physical mobility is extremely affected, because it's not even like waiting in your car. You just are homebound, waiting with your laptop so that Byju's can give you that 1 hour. And in the context of joblessness and precarity, this becomes a kind of a business model to be able to use surplus labor in the labor market. And this kind of pervasive platformization is not just unique to the services industry. And we actually have to understand that even in the garment industry, in the apparels, or in a workshop, or in any shop floor, the ways in which workers in IoT value chains, for instance, how they may be observed is something that has to be part of the way in which we imagine labor rights. And this is very, very classic to the global South. Remotely managed smart farms like Alibaba's pig farms, or even new forms of smart agriculture, might actually have workers who are originally small cultivators, but have been rendered as dispossessed landless laborers in these smart farms, who actually are observed the whole day. And this platformization is not only about wage theft, but it would also amount to data theft, right? So a lot of data is going away from these workers. And I think this idea of what's really happening here may not be captured adequately and accurately by concepts of fair management. And we would really have to look at new frontiers in our vocabulary and semantics to be able to understand what may be more emancipatory or liberating. The next one. So there is a very important idea here on representation that Uniglobal Union in 2020, when it launched this campaign, came up with. And I think that it's worthwhile taking into account that labor rights should not only be adequately aligned to conditions of platform work, but platform workers' unions should also be able to enter into algorithmic use agreements as part of collective bargaining agreements. In dissent, the quote I reproduced from James Ferrer also talks about 3 kinds of data rights: access to the data, the idea of contesting data, and the idea of explainability in data. So these are vital, and the idea that the right to know what tools are being used, the knowledge of what data is being collected, and the right to access that data for various purposes, and not only for collective bargaining, so that I know that you have charged the customer X for a ride that I gave and Y for the ride that somebody else gave. Not only that right, but the ability of a group of workers to be able to use that as evidence in the court, or perhaps even to analyze, what other ways in which they might want to reorganize themselves and structure their collective bargaining strategies, I think is a very, very vital right. I'd like to go back to the wonderful manifesto with just one kind of observation. And that is towards the end of the manifesto in the conclusion. And this talks about how platform work offers livelihood opportunities to many people, and it has the potential to offer flexibility and autonomy to many workers. However, the manifesto argues it's also strongly associated with low pay, precarity, insecurity, and lack of rights. I think that the language should be far more radical, for the reason that the evidence on the ground is challenging the ideas of the potential for flexibility and autonomy in certain categories of employment. Even if there's flexibility and autonomy, that flexibility and autonomy is available for workers with better bargaining power, for instance, in graphics design, right, who are working in cross-border value chains or providing design expertise, or for instance, workers who are coders in AI value chains, right? Not really the average person who is struggling to make a livelihood. So I think that we should say, while platform work offers livelihood opportunities to many people, it is strongly associated with low pay, precarity, insecurity, and lack of rights. For it to have the potential to offer flexibility and autonomy, we of course need to travel. I think for a universal experience of flexibility and autonomy, we really have to traverse a very long course. And to end, I want to throw another idea that in algorithmic settings, not only don't informal sector workers in countries like India who come from the lower castes and lower classes, women, Dalit workers, not only are they deprived of their bargaining rights, but they are the kind of people whose social context of discrimination and indignity may be reified through algorithmic arrangements. And therefore, before we celebrate the potential for flexibility and autonomy, I think it's really important. And there's a whole range of international studies done by independent researchers from around the world with extremely vital information, including from VISO, from the ILO's own research, that shows that the idea of flexibility and autonomy is for the very few, whereas the normalization of precarity and insecurity is very, very universal. And with these, I'd like to end my inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anita, for your presentation. I think we may have to go a couple of minutes after the initial limit of this webinar. Sorry for that. And finally, I would like to give the voice to Veena. Thank you, Veena, for being here. So please, your comments.
Thank you so much for having me and for doing all of this amazing work and for this incredible manifesto and all of the research that went into it. This is Jack. unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave just soon after 8 because I have to take these kids to school. It's morning here from the United States where I'm speaking to you from. We generally don't believe in international law, as you may have noticed in the US. The US has only ratified 2 of the ILO conventions, and those conventions are the ones on slavery and child labor. I want to focus on the fair pay aspect. Jackie, can you go, Daddy, can you take this guy? He's not letting me talk. I want to focus on the fair pay aspect of the manifesto, and say that one of the difficulties, I think, with getting a convention around fair pay is that many will say, well, these things are already embodied in existing ILO recommendations or conventions. So, for example, with regard to fair pay on crowd work, you have some of the language existing in the Homework Convention of 1966 that says that there has to be equality of pay with regard to remuneration of homework and non-homework. And then the employment relationship recommendation of 2006 sort of applies to the application-based platform work. So this, I think, is going to be a difficulty. But one of the things that I want to emphasize, or the primary thing I want to emphasize today, is that the rights embodied in this fair pay aspect of the manifesto actually speak to the ways in which platform work is quite different than other iterations of homework or work that is that moves around. And I want to emphasize this conceptual difference because I think that there is a lot of conversation and debate right now around how this is, not really different. We don't really need different laws or conventions or recommendations to address this. And when we think about sort of the developments around cloud computing technologies, both for data extraction and data storage, and the possibilities of machine learning technologies, we can really see how this has fundamentally changed how workers are surveilled, monitored, controlled, and paid. And in some ways, yes, this is just about sort of speeding up or augmenting existing issues, but in some ways there is actually a qualitative difference. And I want to say that these qualitative differences have actually changed how workers experience time in a way that is akin to the transition from the cottage industry production to factory production, as detailed by E.P. Thompson. And I've written a little bit about this. The objective harms that come from what I call algorithmic wage discrimination, so price discrimination, but as it pertains to the wages of actual workers, include that there is actual, as Anita and others have said, underpayment of workers. So in California, we recently found that as a result of the legal encasing of algorithmic wage discrimination through a recent law here in California, workers are making about $6 an hour in the Bay Area, as opposed to the local minimum wage, which is $16 an hour. And all of that is, of course, happening because workers are not paid for the time that they are not laboring. But this is fundamentally different than the kinds of home pay piecework that happened in the early part of the 20th century, because that time period is determined not by the workers themselves, but rather determined by algorithms. The other sort of objective harm that arises from these payment practices are, of course, erratic pay and differential pay, which actually creates friction between workers. So we all know, those of us who did this research know that a common phenomenon is that one worker will post that they've made X amount of money within an hour, sort of just to brag about what they've done, and other workers say, well, how is that possible? It becomes sort of an aspirational point. It makes workers feel like, why can't I do it? And there's even sort of speculation that those people who sort of post and say, look how much I've made, are post as a way to sort of disrupt worker unity and worker collectivity. And so this problem around around differential pay, this objective problem around differential pay, which is algorithmically enabled, may be addressed through some of the aspects of the manifesto that ensure that all work time is paid for. The fourth objective problem that I want to underscore that makes payment via algorithms quite different than sort of regular piece pay or regular underpayment problems that are manifested in the offline workplace is that algorithms often hide discrimination or objectify discrimination. So we know based on data from Uber in the US that actually women drivers make 7% less than male drivers, according to Uber's own economists. And so what's important to note there is that unlike, say, an intentional discrimination where a company might pay women workers less. With Uber, their own economists can come out and say it, and there's no sort of legal liability because it's all hidden behind an algorithm and it seems unintentional and not the fault of the firm. So it's another objective harm that comes from the payment structures within platform work firms that are quite different than offline firms, and why we might need this manifesto and this convention. Finally, sort of the subjective harms that arise from algorithmic pay discrimination is our gamification. A lot of scholars have talked about gamification, but there's actually a sort of a gamification that occurs that changes the concrete possibilities of work for survival into making life a gamble. And of course, the constant feeling of being manipulated and tricked, which is very, very common for workers who work on platforms because of the constantly changing nature of algorithmic management. And I want to emphasize, as both Alessio and Anita did, that these harms are just both subjective and objective harms are disproportionately borne by subordinated racial minority workers in the US. 70% of people who do this work in Silicon Valley, where I am, are people of color and immigrants. And what this does is not only limit economic equality in very profound ways, but actually limits economic mobility, and is part of the story of stagnation in the US as it relates to economic mobility for minority communities. In the US, I should say that this platform work, the sort of aspects of the manifesto that are about fair pay have already been legally encased in 3 different contexts. And when I say that, I mean that the platform, the problems that the manifesto points out and tries to address have become, actually the problems themselves have become legalized in the US context in California, where it is now legal to not pay workers for non-engaged time, that is work when they're waiting for work. And in Washington State, with regard to the ride-hail industry, where it is now legal, it is in the statute. The firms have written it into the statute that they do not have to pay by law for that non-engaged time, and in a number of other southern states in the South where they haven't specifically referenced non-engaged time, but where they've just said by law that these workers are independent contractors and we don't have to pay them these wages. The last thing I want to point out that I think this manifesto really addresses and sort of isn't spoken about as much is data derivatives. So a huge problem with platform work is not just the low payment for the work done through the platform, but actually the data that is then extracted about workers, the data sets that are then sold and brokered on the market, which immobilize workers in many ways. It cause problems such as employers paying workers what they think they know that they have been paid by previous platforms. Sort of they limit what places workers can get employment because of the data that firms know about workers that are the data which is actually extracted to create the possibility of algorithmic wage discrimination. And so just to say that these sort of data derivatives, downstream data derivative problems will be addressed, will be disincentivized through the rights elaborated in the manifesto. And so I think that this is an incredibly, incredibly important document and an incredibly important moment where researchers all over the world have meticulously documented how the problems experienced by workers in different contexts all over the globe, while in many ways very different, have some fundamentally similar characteristics such that they should be addressed internationally through an ILO convention. And I'm very excited to see the kinds of debate and conversation and hopefully change that arises as a result.
Thank you very much, Fina, for being also so synthetic, because we know the time is limited today. So thank you very much. And so I think we will have to go a couple of minutes for addressing some questions. So I would like to ask to the speakers and the audience to stay in this channel for at least 10 minutes more. And because of time limitation, I think we can address 2 questions. So I would like to address the first one to Alessio. Is Martin's question. I will read it. Is when researchers at such a scale sign a manifesto, how do you secure that the research stays independent and not influenced by possible bias, like a focus on the negative effects and a focus on the bad big platforms? I endorse the manifesto and I'm an ambassador of the work of the foundation, but I wonder how you secure the independent character of the research. Alessio.
Thanks a lot, Oscar, and thanks a lot for Martin, I think, for the very interesting question. I think, I mean, we know that our research in fair work is independent. There are a lot of very good independent researchers out there. Of course, we cannot guarantee that all the people who sign are independent researchers. At the same time, what we want with this manifesto is really universal principles that are applicable to all workers. So if a platform is already good, is already providing standards, in a sense, there's no problem. Like, it's really like we congratulate the platform, but actually what a lot of research has shown that, and also as you've seen from the data presented, just by fair work research, very few platforms.
Sorry, Alessio, can you speak a bit louder or closer?
Yeah, sorry.
To your computer?
Sorry for this problem. I really apologize for this. But I was saying, like, so although we, so a lot of researchers have shown this, what they've also shown is the many problems that these workers face around the world. And as I said earlier, this should be kind of universal principles that are applicable to all workers. So I wouldn't say there is a problem with a negative bias, because as a lot of researchers have recognized, there is the possibility that these workers really face lower barriers to entry, autonomy, and flexibility. But what we highlight, and I think Anita has reiterated, is that this potential doesn't always take place in reality, and it's important to highlight these shortcomings, especially when it comes to regulation, so that all workers, and especially the most vulnerable, should be protected and should be granted basic rights and basic standards of work.
Thank you very much, Alessio. And I would like to present a group of questions that are addressed by Philippe to Anita. So Anita, these questions that I would like that you give us some answer is, how do you set minimum wages on international platform? Also, did you actually ask workers if they want employment status? And there is a follow-up. So according to the current speaker, Anita, each country workers would not be able to work at less than the minimum wage in their country. So the work would only be shown in countries with the lowest minimum wage. Anita, are you still there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
So,
tricky questions. I think that the answer is pretty straightforward. I think the debates on productive jobs in the economy and the debates on minimum wage cannot be kind of, pitted against one another. We can't get into a context where we look at, a kind of international labor hierarchy where there's a race to the bottom, which is a reality, as something that should then be, for instance, in the platform economy, presented as fait accompli, and for us to be able to envision then the available opportunity on, let's say, Zomato or Deliveroo as something that's redeeming for the local youth. I think that discourse, however, real it may be, I think the fight for minimum wage is extremely vital. And in terms of cross-border platforms, there are innumerable ways by which the contributions of commercial transactions, both of goods and services, of platforms is computable and ascribable and as part of the GDP. So, for instance, the taxation debates in the platform economy are also related to the very same thing. And therefore, it should really be possible for platforms to enforce minimum labor standards. And I think that when we talk about how, and many women talk about this, women domestic workers, that they like the identity of being on the platform because it provides a modicum of formalization. Then I think our demand should be that the formal economy cannot be exploitative. The formal economy should certainly carry minimum wages. That's how I approach it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anita, and everyone today. So thank you very much, Alessio, Sandra, Anita, and Fina for such a great discussion. Thanks to all the people that got connected to this webinar. And of course, you are invited to read, discuss, and share the manifesto, and please be in touch. Thanks again and have a good day.